Hello, everybody. I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, and I'm so glad to welcome all of you to this event with Tracy Slater on her new book, Together in Manzanar, The True Story of a Japanese Jewish Family in an American Concentration Camp. I want to thank our co-presenters for tonight's program, the Workers' Circle Arbiter Ring of Northern California, and the San Francisco chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League, which is the oldest Asian American civil rights organization in the United States. And I want to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library who make everything we do at the library possible. I hope you will consider becoming a friend by giving at any level at friendsofthejcl.org. And tonight's program is made possible in part by Judy Baston. The library has a combination of in-person and online events. One upcoming online event I do want to mention is one on Sunday, October 26th, with historian Hazia Diner of New York University and Bill Ong Hing of the University of San Francisco Law School, entitled Closing the Door, the 1924 Immigration Act and its Impact on Jewish and Asian Communities. Please note that automated closed captioning can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button that's at the bottom of your screen, and will all be muted, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end through Zoom's chat function. So please put your questions in the chat and I'll relay them to our speaker, time permitting. I'm very grateful to Tracy Slater for having written Together in Manzanar and providing another lens on an episode in an American history that we must continue to revisit and learn from. It's one I'm particularly conscious of as somebody who works just a few blocks from Japantown and as somebody who is haunted by the often feeble response from the general community, including the Jewish community, when thousands of San Franciscans were forcibly removed from our city in 1942. Tracy Slater is joining us from Toronto, I believe, but she is normally based in her husband's country of Japan. Her previous book was the mixed marriage memoir, The Good Shufu, Finding Love, Self, and Home on the Far Side of the World. Tracy has also published work in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and other publications. And we're just really glad to have you join us, Tracy. So please, it's all yours now.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. Thank you. Big thanks to Howard and the Jewish Community Library and to all of you for joining us. And I also just wanted to reiterate the thanks that Howard gave to not just the Jewish Community Library, but also the JACL San Francisco chapter and the Workers' Circle Arbiter Ring of Northern California for co-sponsoring. It actually feels really special to me to be doing an event that brings together your three communities because they all reflect important aspects of the Oneidas' lives, which we'll talk about more here. So for the first part of our event, I'll give a little bit of an introduction to the Oneidas, a brief explanation of their time in Manzanar and some of the perils that they faced there, and the ways in which they both were and were not unique among the incarcerated population. And if we have time, I'll close with a brief reading that focuses on their life in San Francisco, which is where they lived before Carl Yoneda and Tommy Yoneda. So Elaine, and if you haven't read the book, you might not know, Elaine and Carl Yoneda were married. Elaine was a Jewish American woman, actually like I am. Her husband, Carl, was Japanese American. My husband's Japanese. He's not Japanese American, he's Japanese. And they had a 3-year-old son, Tommy. And they lived in San Francisco before Tommy and Carl were taken to Manzanar. And before Elaine herself had to choose between going to Manzanar with them, which would require her, first of all, to become an incarceree, and second of all, perhaps even a bigger deal for her was that she had to leave behind her white daughter from a previous marriage, a young teenager. So she had to choose when Carl and Tommy were taken to Manzanar between going with them and leaving behind her white daughter, or allowing them to take Tommy, who was actually had been pretty ill for most of his life, allowing them to take her, very vulnerable 3-year-old child without her to detention in a desert. So that's the basic conflict with which the book opens. If we go to the, Howard, if you wouldn't mind going to the first main slide. it is, I have two pictures here of the Yoneda family. The one on the left side of the screen is Elaine as a 2-year-old in New York City, where she lived as a child with her parents, both of whom were immigrants from the Pale of Settlement. And they were activists, labor activists, very involved in the labor movement in Russia. And also when they got here, as was Elaine as she grew older. And then this picture on the right shows Elaine and her husband Carl and their young son Tommy about a month before, no, sorry, not a month, a couple of months before they were removed to Manzanar. And they're at a hospital in San Francisco, St. Luke's Hospital, visiting Tom Mooney, who was a quite a famous labor activist who had been imprisoned for supposedly planting a bomb. He was exonerated years later, but Elaine was very active in the movement to try to free him. She worked for the International Labor Defense Fund. She was very close to Tom Mooney and his family, and they actually named their son Tommy after him. So this is a picture of them visiting him in the hospital, a couple of months before he died, and also a couple of months before Tom Mooney died, and a couple of months before they were sent to Manzanar. So on the next slide, you can see where they ended up, which is Manzanar. And the topic of my book is their time in Manzanar. Almost the entire book takes place in Manzanar. They're an introductory chapter of their lives before Manzanar, and then the book tells at the end what happened to them and how they got through it and what they lost and what they survived. But the bulk of the book is about their time in Manzanar. Before I talk a little bit more about their time in Manzanar, I just wanted to say quickly a few words about why I use the term concentration camp, because I've gotten a lot of questions about it, which I really understand why people are confused about, potentially confused about the term. So on the next slide, I address this. The reason that I use in the title, and I'll use throughout this talk, the term concentration camp as opposed to internment camp, which is actually internment camp is how camps like Manzanar are generally still referred to today. It's the common way that people refer to them, to the camps. And the reason I don't use internment camp, which I feel quite strongly about, is because in the definition of internment is the imprisonment of foreigners, of foreign nationals. And 2/3 of the 120,000 people on the West Coast who were forcibly removed and incarcerated in the United States during World War II were US citizens, born in the US. They'd never been foreigners a day in their lives. So 2/3 of the incarcerees were US citizens. And to continue to use the term internment is actually unwittingly, for almost everybody. It's people don't mean to do this, but the term internment promotes the lie, really, upon which the entire forced removal and incarceration was based, which is that the Japanese race was an enemy race, and that no matter someone's citizenship status or age or health status or whatever, if someone had, quote, Japanese blood, they were foreign. They were just eternally different from real Americans. And this was the justification that was used for incarcerating 120,000 people. As I said, 80 to 90,000 of whom were US citizens. And the last thing I'll say about it is, so in terms of concentration camp, why I use that term, I also use incarceration camp. But the reason that I use concentration camp, although I know that it can be a difficult term to hear, is that the definition of a concentration camp is the definition I have on the slide is actually from Merriam-Webster. It's a place where a large number of people, ethnic minorities, political prisoners, refugees are held under armed guard without due process. And that's pretty much 100% what Manzanar and the other camps like it were. And in fact, in the beginning, particularly in the beginning of the war and in the beginning of the forced removal and incarcerations, the camps were frequently referred to, Manzanar and the other camps, as concentration camps, actually. I'll give two very brief examples. Life magazine on April 6, 1942, ran an article sort of in conversation with many media reports that were reporting about the opening of Manzanar and saying, that Manzanar was actually going to be like a vacation for the Japanese American incarcerees or evacuees, as many in the media called them. And that it was, really not a hardship at all to be sent there. And so Life magazine reported, and I quote, Manzanar, for all its hopes and assets, was a concentration camp designed eventually to detain at least 10,000 potential enemies of the United States. They went on to note that 4/5 of these people would be U.S. citizens. I actually think it ended up being closer to 2/3, but 2/3, 4/5, the great majority. And Life further noticed that, and I quote, the commanding general of the West Coast area promised that the Army would not shrink from using force to complete the, quote, evacuation if other methods failed. And one last quick example I'll give is that all the way back in January of 1942, January 20th, quite soon after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when U.S. politicians and the media and the public were discussing what was going to happen with the Japanese American community, what was going to happen with the German American community and the Italian American community, with the community of people who had emigrated from the countries that we were at war with. Although I will note that none of the German American and Italian American citizens were never imprisoned en masse. It was only Japanese American citizens. But on the floor of the House of Representatives on January 20th, California Representative Leland Ford said, and I quote, any patriotic native-born Japanese, by which he meant a Japanese American citizen, he was using some sort of awkward terminology, who wanted to contribute to the war effort should, quote, submit himself to a concentration camp and, quote, should not object to that small sacrifice. So for all of these reasons, I do not use internment camp, and I will either use concentration camp or incarceration camp throughout the talk. But in the title of my book, I use concentration camp. So anyway, moving on to the story of the Unedas in Manzanar. Howard, on the next slide, I have some pictures of the Unedas in Manzanar. And altogether, these three pictures kind of encapsulate the two hidden histories that their story and that my book, by telling their story, uncovers about the forced removal and incarceration. One is the story of mixed families in these camps. There were mixed families. There were, a couple of thousand people in mixed families who were in these camps. And the other kind of hidden history that the book uncovers is the history of leftists or people who embrace leftist ideology in the camps. The population who embraced leftist causes in Manzanar and in the other camps like it was a population who confronted, many struggles about how to support the Allied forces against the fascist Axis and the American war effort from inside American concentration camps themselves. And I will add, particularly in reference to the JACL in Manzanar. As I said, I'm thrilled that there are people from the JACL joining us tonight. There were the JACL leaders. There were some JACL leaders in Manzanar who joined some of the leftists and definitely the Unedas in this commitment to support the U.S. war effort. Though with the JACL leaders, the documentation that they left behind suggests that they agitated for the war effort for a slightly different reason. The importance in their eyes of proving the loyalty of the Japanese American community in order to sort of ease the eventual resettlement back into society if and when the war ended, which was also something that the Unitas felt strongly about. But the Unitas and other leftists in the camp, first and foremost, felt that they needed to support the fight against fascism and that had to take precedence over everything else. But for going back just quickly to the story of the mixed families in the camps, and in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about it, but I just wanted to point out the picture in the middle here is of Elaine and Tommy and Carl in Manzanar. This is about 3 months after they arrived in Manzanar. And actually, all three of these pictures were taken on the same weekend, just coincidentally. But in the middle picture, they actually had visitors that weekend. There were visitors who were allowed in Manzanar sometimes, and sometimes visitors were not allowed. But this was a period of time in which visitors were allowed, and they had a sort of a leftist friend, one of their comrades who, as they sometimes referred to her, who came to visit them. She's on the far right of the picture in the white shirt. Her name was Happy Brennan. And she brought Elaine's daughter, Joyce, to visit Manzanar, and you can see Joyce sort of in the background, as if she's kind of fading into the background of the desert. And I think it's a sort of vivid and, to me, moving representation of the way in which Manzanar really fractured the Unitas family, and sort of in many ways erased Joyce's place in the family. She never again lived with her mother or her brother. It was a sort of break for her, and the trauma and the family separations that mixed families suffered through because of the forced removal and incarceration, I think, is an important history to remember and respect. And the other reason why I think both of these hidden histories are really crucially important goes back to what I had said earlier about this concept of the lie upon which the entire forced removal and incarceration was built. This concept of the Japanese race being an enemy race is also intimately tied to this concept that everybody who was forcibly removed and incarcerated were, because they all had Japanese blood, they were essentially the same, and they were essentially different from Americans, but they were in themselves all essentially the same. There were top military and government officials who said things like, a Jap is a Jap's horrible, horrible statement. But in other words, a Japanese person is Japanese, no matter anything else about them. That's the defining issue. And that was, as I said, one of the very damaging and disturbing lies upon which the forced removal and incarceration were built. And if we look at the history of mixed race families in the camp and the history of the real ideological mix of the entire incarcerated population, both of these, I think, really stress the heterogeneity of the camp population, and that's really important, I think, to remember as a way to kind of answer back to this history of this false belief that the entire population of people who were incarcerated were just sort of one homogenous block of danger, really. So on the next slide, I have a little bit of information about mixed families in the camps. I've got some statistics here that you can see about, so there were about 2,100 people in mixed families who were incarcerated at one point or another, not just in Manzanar. There were Manzanar and there were 9 other sort of long-term concentration camps for Japanese Americans on the West Coast. And there were about 2,100 people in mixed families who were incarcerated at some point at one or another in these camps. And not all these people were themselves mixed. Some of them were people like Carl Yoneda, who was of Japanese descent on both sides of his family, but he had formed a mixed family himself. And there were actually other people in the camp, like Elaine Yoneda, who were not Japanese at all. who had no known Japanese descent at all. Most of these were wives and mothers who didn't want to be separated from their children and their spouses. Um, Elaine was the only Jewish woman on record in any of the camps. And Tommy was the only Japanese Jewish person on record in any of the camps. But in terms of Elaine not having any Japanese heritage and Tommy being mixed, in that way, they were not completely unique. And reasons that I one of the reasons that the history of the mixed families in the camps is so important, beyond just the fact that it helps to stress the heterogeneity of the population, and because we need to honor this part of our history, is because if we look at the reactions to the mixed families in the camps among the administration, the army, and the government, and the policies used to kind of identify and police these families, we'll see, perhaps paradoxically, this sort of most vivid and really stunning example of the racial obsession that underlay the entire forced removal and incarceration, and really speaks back to the other part of the huge myth that underlay this entire project, which is that the forced removal and incarceration was due to military necessity. If you look at the policies and the reactions to the mixed families in the camps, you'll see that this really had nothing to do with military necessity. It had so much to do with racial obsession. And you can see here in this quote from the newspaper, from the man who actually sort of authored and ran the entire forced removal and the beginning of the incarceration, that anyone who had, as he said, one drop of Japanese blood needed to be sent to camp, even orphans, even infants, even elderly people and infirm people. And so clearly this was not about danger to the nation. On the next slide, we see perhaps even more stunning example of this sort of racial obsession that underlay the incarceration in and through the policies of the mixed marriages families, or the mixed blood families. The policy that identified and policed these families were alternately called the mixed marriage or the mixed blood policy. The administrators of the camps and the government used both terms sort of interchangeably. I just want to point out a few things here for the sake of time. I won't go through these whole documents, but I want to point out a couple of things about both of these documents. And if anyone wants to actually see these copies of these documents, feel free to get in touch with me if you want to look more closely and at length. But I will point out that on the left side, what we see is a form for non-Japanese people with no Japanese descent, who, like Elaine, did not want to have their children or their spouses taken away and sent to detention without them. And by May of 1942, the administrators who were organizing the forced removal and registering families to be sent to different camps, were coming across more and more mixed families and more people who were not of Japanese descent, and they didn't know what to do. So the government came up with this form. It was called the Request and Waiver of a Non-Excluded Person. And it was a form that a non-Japanese family member was required to fill out if they wanted to not be separated from their family. There was no question that their family was going to be taken. The solution, the government never gave the solution that, oh, well, the family can stay out of camp. Their solution was, well, then the non-Japanese person can enter camp. But before the non-Japanese person could do this, they had to sign a form that said that they elect to accompany his or her Japanese ancestry, spouse, or child into an assembly reception center. So that was the euphemism that the Army was using to describe these camps. And in signing this form, they had to, and the arrow is pointing towards this one line because it's so chilling. They had to agree to conform in all respects as if a person of Japanese ancestry, which included waiving the right to leave. So they had to agree to become an incarceree. But they had to sort of symbolically change their ethnicity in order to change their incarcerability, really, or their eligibility, their loss of eligibility for freedom. And at the bottom of the form, they have to do this all while attesting that they had personally solicited this fate without persuasion or duress. So that's the form on the left side. On the right side is a form that was released in July of 1942. After the forced removal was finished, the entire West Coast had been emptied of Japanese Americans, except for people who were incarcerated in camps. And despite this ruse that everybody in camp was either Japanese or as if Japanese, it became clear throughout the spring and summer of 1942 that there were a growing number of mixed race people in the camps, as well as non-Japanese people and mixed families who were incarcerated. And this caused some consternation among the administration and the military. So in early July 1942, this mixed marriage policy was announced. It went through multiple iterations because it was so problematic, and so much of it was just absurd. But its objective, as one top military official said, was to protect mixed blood children and adults from a Japanese environment. And what this policy did was it mandated along various race and gender lines who could apply for release, for freedom from camp, and who among these people who were allowed to apply in mixed families, who among them could apply to return home to the West Coast, and who among them could apply for freedom but could not go home, would have to find some way to resettle their lives east. And I will just point out a few things within this policy that are quite stunning. So within this matrix of eligibility for freedom and return home based on the gender and ethnic mix of the family, a couple of the sort of categories were that mixed families composed of a Japanese or Japanese American husband and a Caucasian wife with their unemancipated children, so with their minor children, they could be released. They could apply for release, but only on the condition that they agree to resettle east, or that they were able to resettle east. So they were not allowed to go home. They were not allowed to go to the West Coast. However, families that were composed of a Caucasian U.S. citizen husband, his Japanese or Japanese American wife, and their young children, their unemancipated mixed race children, they could be released and returned to their restricted area or the West Coast, return home, as long as they could somehow prove that the environment of the family before the war had been Caucasian. So nobody knew what that meant, which is one reason there were so many iterations of the policy, because really it doesn't mean anything. And eventually, after multiple iterations, a family composed of a Caucasian mother could apply for permission for freedom to leave camp and to go home with their mixed children, but only on the condition that, and this is the part that I have the arrow to on the slide, only on the condition that her Japanese husband who had sired her children was either dead or long since separated by the family. And then the last category I'll point out is that the policy also mentions that adult individuals of mixed blood who were U.S. citizens could apply to return home if their environment before the war, could be proven to have been Caucasian, their home environment, and if they had one half or less Japanese blood. So we can really see the intense obsession with, blood quantum and measuring the supposed danger of an American citizen or an American resident based on, percentages of ethnicity and also the gender mix of the family. So that's the kind of part of the hidden history about mixed families that the book uncovers and tells the story of, alongside the story of the Onedas. If we go to the next slide, we see this second hidden history, which is the leftists both in and around the camps, the kind of tension with leftist ideology, both among the incarcerees and among people outside of camp. Um, and within Manzanar, Elaine and Carl were two of the most vocal, if not the most vocal, sort of leftist leaders. Within Manzanar, there were certainly other people in other camps. And I have to say that they actually faced much more turmoil in camp for their outspoken leftist politics than for the mixed ethnic background of their family, or even for Elaine's Jewish identity. Though, of course, both of these things played a role in some of the strife that they encountered, and they did encounter some anti-Semitism in camp, which I talk about in the book. But partly because of Elaine's Jewish identity, and certainly because of the Yoneda's long-standing passionate devotion to fighting fascism and fighting for leftist causes. Well before the war, they were leftist leaders. Because of this sort of longstanding devotion that they had, they showed a repeated willingness to do anything they could when they were in Manzanar, and as loudly as they could, actually, to support the United States and its allies fight against the Axis. And part and parcel of this for the Yonedas and for many other leftists, both within and outside of camp, was a deep unwillingness to criticize the United States government while it was at war, while it was fighting, even from within a concentration camp themselves. And this was particularly, I think, searing for the Yonedas. They were in Manzanar in 1942. Looking back now, it's hard to remember, maybe, if we're not steeped in the history. But in 1942, it actually really seemed like the Allies were going to lose. Both the German and the Japanese Imperial Army were making way more gains than the U.S. and its allies were. So they felt very keenly this desire to support the U.S. government and its allies, and also this incredible fear that that the allies might lose, and if they did lose, they knew their family wouldn't survive. So this was a position that they actually were steeped in as part of the leftist community outside of camp. They subscribed to leftist newspapers. They wrote letters all the time. It was extremely important to them to keep their connection to the community that had always sort of fed their souls. And if you look at the two examples I have here, it might be a little bit hard to see, but on the right is actually an article about the removal of the San Francisco Japanese American community. So Elaine and Carl had gone to LA right before Carl was went to Manzanar first. They went to LA right before Carl went to Manzanar, thinking Elaine and Tommy could live with Elaine's parents, Elaine, Tommy, and Joyce, and maybe Elaine and Tommy could go visit Carl if visits were to be allowed. So they went down to LA. And then a couple of weeks after, they realized that they were all going to be sent to Manzanar, and were all sent to Manzanar. The San Francisco Japanese American community began to be removed. And this article is from a newspaper called People's World, which was a leftist newspaper. And it was reporting on the removal of the San Francisco Japanese American community. And you can really see here the kind of ambivalence in this article about the camps, and the sort of desire to balance admission that it was a hard situation, but without saying that it was at base not okay. And I'll just read briefly. It might be a little bit hard to see on the slide when I describe this in the book. April 8th's front page article covered the removal of San Francisco's ethnic Japanese to the horse stalls of Santa Anita's racetrack. The Japanese American community from San Francisco was removed to a place that had conditions even worse than Manzanar. The incarcerees, many of them were housed in animal stalls. Japanese wave goodbye to San Francisco, ran the main headline, appearing under a picture of a little girl in a kimono, sleeves splayed like a butterfly. Kids take it as a picnic, said the subhead. The paper described the evacuation, quote, the evacuation as efficient and civil, calling the military police courteous and friendly, despite the steel helmets and army revolvers gleaming in leather holsters. The tag around the neck was a tough thing for some of the proud young American Japanese to take, they reported. But no resentment showed itself. None of them liked it, except one kindly old man who had no sense. But they were all glad to cooperate and do their part. They seemed to understand why it was necessary. That is, all except the really old people who were pained and bewildered. So, um, that was the kind of media that they were exposed to in camp because, as I said, they subscribed to the People's World and papers like it. And then the last quote, the last thing I'll point out on this slide is just this quote that was actually said by a visitor. They had a visitor in Manzanar, Jewish reporter who worked for one of the Jewish leftist newspapers, who had come to Manzanar to visit them and also to take notes about the conditions of the camp. And he saw the conditions and the situation, and he said to them, to the Onedas, this is clearly not right and not okay, but there's just no energy or resources left over to pay attention to this right now. What we have to do is prioritize the fight against the Axis. And this, as I mentioned earlier, was a position that the Onedas themselves really embraced and loudly embraced and stressed, even among the incarcerated population in Manzanar, that this was the attitude that everybody should take, because everyone needed to prioritize fighting against the Axis over any crime that maybe was being committed by the forced removal and incarceration. And they felt very clearly that if this is a civil rights violation, it needs to be addressed after the war, that we cannot address this now. And so this, as you can see from this quote, was a sentiment that was shared in the community around them outside of camp as well. And so these sort of ideological stresses or conflicts were what eventually led to the climax of the book and the most deadly event to sweep the camp, which I'll touch on very briefly on the last slide. The Manzanar riot or revolt. The Onedas referred to it as the riot. Historians today generally refer to it as the Manzanar revolt or uprising. That's the term that I generally use. It occurred in early December, and as I said, it forms the climax of the Oneda's time in Manzanar. It was a quite violent uprising against both the camp administration and anyone in camp who was considered too acquiescent to them, and too willing to go along with the entire forced removal and incarceration, or unwilling to agitate against it. It was a fuse that was lit in part by the ideological tensions in camp, and also I think in greater part, and even the Onedas, admitted, in greater part it was a fuse that was lit by anger and distress at the treatment that the incarcerees were receiving in camp and had received in the entire process of being divested of all their property and then brought to camp. The revolt or uprising or riot became even more violent once the military police were brought in to try to get the camp under control. And for the Onedas, particularly Elaine and Tommy, this was their most perilous time in Manzanar. I won't spoil the climax of the story, but Elaine learned soon after the riot began that both Carl and Tommy had been put on a death list, had been marked for death. And the climax of the story is Elaine's figuring out how if there's a way to escape with her life's son intact. So I'll leave it there for now. Howard, I was going to read a little bit more from the book, but I don't think I will because it's 9:41. So I want to give people a chance to ask questions.
Okay, so I'll stop the slides and I will open it to questions. So anybody can put their questions in the chat, and I will relay those. Wait 1 second. Um, uh, uh, let's see. Just looking for, we have some very interesting comments, and I'm looking for a question uh, for you. But so maybe if folks can put their questions in the chat, and I'll maybe just start with one just about your process and your experience in researching this and what you expected, what you experienced in doing the extensive research for this book.
Sure. Well, I started working on this book during COVID. And so there was a lot of research involved, but it was all remote. I was incredibly lucky in that there is a lot of information that you can access online about the forced removal and incarceration in general. I believe much of this is due to the effort of the Japanese American community in making sure that this documentation has been saved and is accessible. So in terms of the kind of general scene setting that I was able to do about Manzanar, that I was able to do all of that, almost all of that online. I think I was able to do all of that online. In terms of the Yoneda's individual experiences, they both have archives because they were labor activists, and so they were actually in the media a lot, quite even before the war. Not a lot had been written about their time in Manzanar, but a lot had been written about their lives before Manzanar, and then they were involved in the reparations movement after Manzanar. So, you can I could find a lot of information about them in the media, but they also in the like on newspapers.com, like in the media, in the newspaper archives. But they also themselves had archives. Carl's archive is in LA and Elaine's is in San Francisco, and it was COVID, as I said, and I have a little one, and I believe Toronto had the longest school closures maybe of North America, anywhere in North America. So I couldn't travel, even when the lockdowns were lifted. But the archivists were unbelievably generous and awesome in that they copied so much material for me and just emailed it to me. So I was able to access archival material even though I couldn't travel. And then I will also add that I was able to find the Yoneda's descendants. I was able to find their grandchildren, and their particularly one of their granddaughters. I interviewed a number of times, and she was unbelievably wonderful. She was incredibly open about her family. She gave me material that wasn't in the archive, and she said to me, "You write whatever you find that that is true, and I won't stop you. I won't try to hide anything about my family." And it was really like a nonfiction writer's dream to have this. So yeah, so that's the basic details about their research.
Great, thanks. So David Fisher asks, he says, perhaps not directly related to the Oneida Black family, but do address the issue of Japanese male citizens swearing loyalty to the U.S. and being willing to fight for the U.S. Armed Forces, and the so-called no-no boys who refuse to swear loyalty. Uh, and yeah, so
Yes. So that's a great question. So I don't go too far in depth in the book about this because the Yonedas actually had left Manzanar by the time the loyalty questionnaire was disseminated. Carl was one of the first volunteers to go to war. He went to the Pacific Front. He was one of the first volunteers of any of the he was the first group of volunteers from any of the camps to go. And so he left before the loyalty questionnaire was disseminated. And Elaine and Tommy, had barely escaped this uprising, so they were not in Manzanar at the time. But I do address it. Obliquely is not quite the right word, but I do address it to some extent in that Carl, before he left Manzanar, he strenuously advocated for a kind of loyalty questionnaire, and he ended up it was one of the things that he ended up, I think, regretting. I don't think he regretted necessarily the idea of it, but he saw the way that the government ended up doing it ended up being a sort of horrible fiasco. And so I have some scenes that touch on that. And then I also have some documentation in the, there's like 50 pages of endnotes in the book. And there's some documentation there if you're interested in finding out more about it. I also um, did not necessarily put in the book, but did research it and have quite a few resources. So if I don't know if the questioner sounds like the questioner is actually kind of knowledgeable about it anyway, but if the questioner or anybody else is interested in learning more about it and wants to know other resources, feel free to get in touch with me. And I'd be happy to uh, to send more information about it. It is a really interesting and distressing part of the history, but not one that the Unedas themselves were in Manzanar for.
Thank you. So Emily from the Japanese American Citizens League asks, how did Elaine Yoneda endure the experience? Did you find her writings about it? And was there evidence that her Jewish heritage contributed to her resilience?
Yeah. Oh, such a good question. Yes. So I found by accident her handwritten diary, actually, which was for some reason in Carl's archive. I did find her diary. She did write a lot after camp that she published in various newspapers. She and Carl are always super engaged before and after camp and during camp. I also found her handwritten diary that she wrote during Manzanar. So that's and Carl, right before I got the contract to write the book, I was put in touch with the translator of Carl's diary. Carl had written a diary. He was in Manzanar as well. His diary was in Japanese and it was translated by this fantastic translator who's actually a Canadian. I'm not Canadian. I'm from the U.S., but we're here right now. And anyway, he in Carl's diary, which I don't, my Japanese is not nearly good enough to read like a whole diary in Japanese. But this Ian Forsyth, his translation of Carl's diary, part of Carl's diary at the end actually reproduces some of Elaine's diary that she had written in her diary. Then she wrote him letters that were, sort of mirroring what she had written in the diary. And also he had a copy of her diary, and so he transcribed part of it. So I was able to get Elaine's experience besides just what was in the newspapers that she had written about her experience. I was able to learn about it from those resources. And then the second part of the question was yes. So Elaine did a number of times. She was not religious. She was very proud of her Jewish heritage, but she was not engaged in the sort of religious tradition necessarily or the religious practice. But she did a number of times, intimate that she didn't, she was very clear that she was a fighter. She would have self-identified as a fighter, definitely. And that her Jewish background and her parents' background, escaping Europe the anti-Semitism there and the pogroms, also the anti kind of leftist violence against like the Jewish labor Bund and stuff like that. Those were all experiences that she either experienced or heard about that really formed her strong feeling. She said, you don't start a fight, but you absolutely never run away from one. And she did connect that to her Jewish heritage. And she was proud of it, although she wasn't, religious, but she was very proud of her Jewish identity. So I hope that answered the question.
All right, thank you. Lydia asks whether mixed families were allowed to observe their religious beliefs and rituals while incarcerated.
Yeah, that's also a great question. So in the beginning, there was no Buddhist, nothing that had any connection to Japanese heritage was allowed to be practiced in the camp. And then that eventually changed, and there was some Buddhist ritual that was allowed. Um, there was church in camp. There was no temple. There was no Jewish practice. I'm assuming they would have allowed Elaine to practice if she had wanted to, but she didn't want to, and she and Tom were the only Jewish people on record. So yeah, I don't think there was any prohibition against religion for mixed families, except for in the beginning anything that that was tied into traditional Japanese culture.
Great, thanks. So there were a couple of questions about mixed families, about people being able to get out at a certain point. And one was a question in general, instances where that could happen, and then specific to Elaine and Tommy's situation.
Okay. So sorry, was the first part of the question like how when were mixed families allowed to apply for release or how or
Where people, yeah, let's say, the question is, do you have any documentation of instances where a non-Japanese man or woman was able to leave detention with their mixed blood child after being
yeah.
incarcerated?
Yes, yes, I am. So in the book, there are a number of instances that, and again, everything is cited. And so if you want to find the original documentation, you can. There were I have the exact number in the book, and I don't want to. I want to say that I may be misquoting the number here from memory, but the exact information is in the book. I think by 1943, I think the government had counted around 400 people in mixed families who were released and allowed to return to the West Coast. Very few people went east because they couldn't. People basically couldn't afford it, and they didn't know anybody. The great majority of people, not everybody, but the great majority of the people who were released under the mixed marriage policy did end up going back to the West Coast, and there was a little bit more wiggle room as the war went on. Um, yes, there were, and there is documentation, and if you can't find it in the citations in the book, or you just want to know, feel free to contact me, and I can send you links to it. This is all actually you can find it online. It's a little hard sometimes to find online, but it is all online it's all in the National Archives, basically, but a lot of it has been reproduced. There's a lot of fantastic documentation, just in general, I'll say, that is much more easily accessible because it's easier to search on this website for this organization called Densho, which is an incredible organization. They are like an archival and history organization for Japanese American history, and they have a ton of stuff about the incarceration, the forced removal and incarceration, and they do have documents there about mixed marriage families. And actually, I before I started this book, I wrote an article for them about the mixed marriage policy. So you can also look that up, and you can see there are links in the citations for that too to some of the documentation. So, but if you want more specific information, feel free to get in touch. So, did I answer the whole question?
I think that's great. Oh, no, well, specific to Elaine's, to Elaine and Tommy.
Oh, so yeah, so their situation was unusual for a number of reasons. Elaine was the first non-Japanese mother, mother with no known Japanese descent to go into the camps. She and Tommy were in the first sort of group of incarcerees to go to Manzanar, the first general group. Carl had gone a week earlier under circumstances that I explain in the book, but I don't want to take up too much time here explaining it. But so after very early April is when the policy started emerging because the administrators began noticing that there were more people like Elaine. Elaine argued the opening scene of the book is the military trying to take Tommy without Elaine. Because in the very beginning they thought there's no way we can let this white woman into camp, and she basically badgered them into accepting her on the transport that she said, you're not taking my son. So but after that they realized that there were actually more situations. So she was not she did not have a form where she attested to become as if Japanese because that form was produced after she was already in camp. And she didn't end up being released under the mixed marriage policy either because the group of people who were threatened and marked for death in Manzanar for their politics. That group of people ended up being processed under a different policy, under different. Well, it wasn't really a policy like the mixed marriage policy, but the camp addressed that issue differently. So again, I don't want to give away too much of the ending in case some people want to read it, but it is explained there. But that's a really good question. And she was not released under the mixed marriage policy, but she did. She survived Manzanar. She got out with her son.
Great, thank you. So Moshe writes that he notes that you refer to the Yonedas as being of leftist ideology. However, both of them were members of the Communist Party from an early age and remained so until their death in old age, but you never called them communists, and he's wondering about your choice of terminology.
Yeah, they were communists, and the only reason I don't use communist generally is because I probably in this group of people it would make a lot of sense and it wouldn't be confusing. But I think some people in the U.S. and the general public might not understand that. Like, I'm not saying that they're you know like necessarily backing contemporary communist countries. So, and I think Elaine and Carl, um, I think their sympathies lay with the whole sort of range of leftist ideologies. I mean, they were first and foremost involved in the labor movement. And Elaine said, I in the historical chapter in the book, I quote her as saying, she ended up joining the Communist Party because in the International Labor Defense Fund, um, they were the people who never backed down. Like, they seemed, that's not the exact quote, but something like they were like the toughest, and she was the most impressed with them. So they were lifelong communists. And although they weren't that involved in the Communist Party for a while after camp, but that's because they were struggling so much to just get their life back on track. So yes, so that is correct. And that is correct terminology. And probably in this context, it would be better to use that. But I tend to describe them in general as leftists because I think that is less confusing maybe to a contemporary American audience. That's a great question.
Right. And I think this will be our last question given the time. But Harriet asks if you can speak a little more about Joyce and her life both during this period and afterwards.
Yeah, I'm really touched that you asked that question because she is really important. She's really actually, it's very hard to trace what happened to her as fully as what happened to the rest of the Onedas. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that Elaine and, excuse me, Carl wanted to protect her privacy. Um, she was very troubled. She never recovered from, I think I can't say that all of her troubles stemmed from Manzanar, but she never got her life on track after her family was fragmented by Manzanar. She never lived with her mother or her brother again. Um, she ran away multiple times. She ended up getting married at 15, like lying about her age. I mean, she had real substance abuse problems as an adult. So her life was really tragic, and so was Tommy's actually. So I think that we can't know for sure. We can never know for sure what causes anybody's sort of trauma and difficulty coping, but it's quite unlikely that Manzanar didn't play some role in that. And I think the fact that we can't fully trace exactly what happened to her with the same specificity as we can for the rest of the Onedas in some ways is really unfortunate, especially for a historian. But in another way, it actually kind of feels fitting in a really sad way, in that the story of mixed families, there isn't as much of a trace for these families, and but these families were fragmented in a really I think, traumatic and tragic way. But the last chapter of my book does talk about Joyce after camp and the struggles that she had. And I'm touched that people thought of her, because I think of her a lot too. So yeah. Can I just quickly add, if anyone, I can't actually see the questions, which is probably good, because I probably would have gotten distracted. But if anyone had a question or even a comment that didn't get addressed, that where you would like me to address it, I welcome you wholeheartedly to get in touch, and I'd be happy to supply more information.
Great, thanks. And I will go ahead tomorrow. I will send an email message to all of you who registered, and it'll include the address for Tracy's website, which has the means to contact her through it. Um, and Tracy, I want to thank you so much for really a very wonderful presentation. And I want to thank you for a great book and for all the enormous amount of research that went into it, that
Thank
is
you so
in this
much.
program.
And thanks to everybody for joining tonight. It's nice to see all the faces.
Thank you. And special thanks to the Japanese American Citizens League, and to the Workers Circle Collaborator Ring. And I really appreciate your partnership, and I appreciate everybody joining. And for those who celebrate, I wish a sweet New Year to all of you, no matter your background. And uh, and may we see a better time soon. Okay. All the best.
Thank you, Howard. Thanks, everyone.